Ethan Harper's life was a seamless blend of wealth, power, and privilege, a carefully constructed image that had long become his identity. At 43, he was the CEO of one of the most successful tech companies in Silicon Valley, a man who could command a meeting with the click of a button or negotiate multi-million-dollar deals with a snap of his fingers. His penthouse, located in a high-rise building that touched the sky, was the crown jewel of his success. Gleaming glass, sleek surfaces, and minimalist decor that screamed luxury without saying a word. Ethan's world was one of opulence, a carefully curated life where every item had a purpose, every moment meticulously scheduled. His mornings began with a private driver who whisked him away in a black sedan to his office, where the day unfolded in a predictable rhythm. His coffee was always the same, an organic, artisanal blend brewed to perfection, and his suits were tailored to match his high status. His office overlooked the city, but he barely noticed the view anymore. He had seen it 1,000 times. From the outside, Ethan appeared to have it all: success, wealth, a thriving business empire, and a life that others only dreamed of. But beneath the polished exterior, something was missing. Ethan had long stopped wondering if he was truly happy. Happiness, he decided, was an illusion for the weak. He lived in the fast lane, always chasing the next big deal, the next acquisition, the next quarter's profit margin. It was a game he was winning, but there was a hollowness to it, an emptiness that he couldn't shake. His colleagues, employees, and the media lauded him for his brilliance, his business acumen, and his ability to make decisions that reshaped industries. Yet, behind closed doors, Ethan was starting to wonder if there was more to life than numbers, strategies, and the constant pressure to climb higher. He had become numb to the world outside his circle. Charitable causes, social issues, and the struggles of the less fortunate were things that appeared on his radar only when they affected his business, or when the media presented them as crises. Homelessness, in particular, was an issue that never seemed to register with him. In Ethan's mind, those who were homeless were simply people who had made bad choices, individuals who had failed to adapt, or who were unwilling to work hard enough to pull themselves up. He had no time for the complexities of systemic poverty or the harsh realities that some people faced every day. Ethan's disconnection wasn't out of malice. He simply didn't know. His world had always been one where people were accountable for their own lives. If someone had lost their job, it was their fault. If they couldn't afford housing, they were too lazy or irresponsible. And in the rare instances when he did cross paths with the homeless, he would look away. It was easier that way. Easier to pretend they didn't exist. Easier to shut out the voices that called for empathy and change. Yet beneath the surface, there was a growing discomfort. It wasn't that Ethan cared for those in need. It was that he couldn't ignore them anymore. There was something about the recent news reports and headlines, the increasingly visible presence of homelessness in the streets near his office, that began to stir something in him. He saw the protests, heard the stories of families displaced, and read about the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Still, he told himself, that's someone else's problem. He could afford to live his life without ever having to confront the poverty outside his door. Despite his indifference, something had shifted. Ethan had begun to feel an emptiness he couldn't ignore. It wasn't the emptiness of financial insecurity. He didn't know what that felt like, but a deeper, more existential kind. It was a gnawing sensation, a quiet voice in the back of his mind that wondered if he was doing enough. Enough for the world, enough for society. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, one that had kept him up late some nights, staring out at the city lights. But it was fleeting and easily drowned by the next deal, the next meeting, the next success. Ethan's life had become a series of ticking boxes, each achievement checked off with precision. The numbers added up, the spreadsheets turned green, and the accolades piled high. But the question remained, was he truly making a difference? Or was he simply existing in a cycle of personal gain, disconnected from the greater purpose of life? And that was how Ethan Harper found himself sitting in the front row of a charity gala one rainy Thursday evening in San Francisco, listening, though not particularly interested, to an activist speak passionately about homelessness. The charity gala was exactly what Ethan expected. A meticulously organized event where the glittering of designer gowns and the sparkle of diamond-encrusted watches outshone the dim lighting of the ballroom. Wealth and status filled the room like a dense fog, each guest as polished as the silver chandeliers overhead. The night was a celebration of excess, and Ethan was content to be just another attendee, a man in a sea of names that all carried weight. There were no surprises in this world. The same faces, the same clinks of champagne glasses, the same rehearsed pleasantries. Everything was designed to remind him of his place at the top of the food chain. Ethan stood near the back of the room, half-heartedly listening to the speeches and introductions, his eyes scanning the room for the most influential guests to talk to. The event, a fundraiser for the city's homeless shelters, was a regular feature on his calendar, one that he had attended numerous times over the years. But the cause, despite the occasional polite applause, had always felt distant to him. Homelessness wasn't his issue, he thought. There were plenty of people who handled it, nonprofits, social workers, politicians, but it was not something he needed to get involved in. He had other priorities, like the quarterly earnings report or the latest business merger. The keynote speaker for the evening, however, was different from the usual roster of bland philanthropists or celebrity ambassadors. When Sarah Lawson took the stage, the atmosphere shifted. She wasn't a polished figure of wealth or status. There were no lavish designer dresses or six-figure accessories. She wore a simple black dress that clung to her slender frame and had none of the usual airs of someone speaking to an audience of billionaires. Instead, she radiated an intense, quiet power, her eyes sharp and focused, and her voice clear yet full of urgency. Her speech began with stark statistics about the rising rates of homelessness in the city, but it wasn't just numbers that she spoke of. She painted vivid pictures of lives shattered by systemic injustice, of families living in their cars, of veterans returning home to nothing, of children who would never know what it was like to grow up with a home. Sarah spoke with a kind of raw honesty that cut through the polished veneer of the gala. She spoke not as a philanthropist, but as a human being who had seen firsthand the brutal realities of life on the streets. Ethan, who had been half listening while checking his phone for emails, suddenly found himself listening intently. There was a fire in Sarah's words, something that felt personal. She wasn't speaking for the cameras or the rich donors in the room. She wasn't asking for money. She was asking for understanding. She was calling for people to step outside their ivory towers, to stop seeing homelessness as an abstract issue to be solved with a check or a one-off donation. Sarah's words seemed to pierce through the shallow conversation of the room. "It's easy," she said, "to turn a blind eye to suffering when it doesn't affect you. It's easy to think someone else will handle it, or they just need to try harder. But let me tell you something. The people who are homeless are not statistics. They are mothers, fathers, children. They are veterans who fought for our country. They are brothers, sisters, friends who've fallen through cracks you didn't even know existed. And they need more than just your charity. They need your attention." Her gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with several people, including Ethan, and for a moment, he felt an odd discomfort. He had never thought about it that way, never really looked at the issue as anything more than a blip on the radar of social problems. To him, homelessness was just a category of people to be managed by government agencies or nonprofits, nothing that directly demanded his involvement. But Sarah wasn't finished. She paused, then continued with a challenge that made Ethan shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I ask you tonight, not just for your money, but for your empathy. I ask you to take a step outside of your comfort zone. Put yourself in their shoes, even if only for a moment. Understand the systems that failed them, and then take action. Do not let this be another evening where you leave here feeling good about yourself, because you've written a check. I ask you to live the change that is so desperately needed." The silence that followed her words was profound. It hung heavy in the air as the guests slowly began to applaud. But the applause was muted, unsure, as if no one really knew how to respond. It was the kind of applause that came from an obligation, not from the heart. But Ethan couldn't shake her words. They stuck with him like an echo in a hollow room, resonating in his mind long after the applause had died down. After the speech, there was the usual mingling, handshakes, forced smiles, polite conversations. Ethan tried to shake off the feeling that had crept up on him, but it clung to him stubbornly. He couldn't deny that something had shifted in him, something small but significant. As the evening wore on, he found himself absent-mindedly making his way toward the exit, his mind racing. He had seen the homeless before, brief encounters on the streets or in news reports, but he had never thought of them as individuals, as people with names, with stories. He had never thought of them as part of a larger system that he, in his comfortable corner of the world, could help influence. It wasn't that Ethan didn't believe in charity. He did in a detached way. He gave to causes, sat on boards, attended galas like tonight. But those actions were never personal. They were boxes he ticked to maintain his image, to keep up appearances. But what Sarah had said, it challenged him in a way he wasn't prepared for. What if he did more than just write a check? What if he really understood, just for once, what it meant to struggle, to be on the other side of wealth and privilege? The thought was fleeting, quickly buried beneath the demands of his busy life. But it nagged at him as he left the gala and slid into his private car. As the sleek sedan pulled away, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's words had planted something in him, something that would eventually grow, whether he wanted it to or not. The night after the gala, Ethan found himself unable to shake Sarah Lawson's words. He was alone in his penthouse, sitting in his sleek, leather-bound chair with a glass of bourbon in hand, but the usual comfort of his surroundings felt distant. He had spent the evening telling himself that he was simply moved by a good speech. Nothing more. But that excuse didn't hold up. The images of the families, the veterans, the children without homes haunted him. There was a dissonance in his mind that he couldn't resolve, a small, nagging voice that refused to be ignored. The next day, he woke up and began his usual routine, checking emails, attending meetings, signing off on executive decisions. The company had just secured another major investment, and everything was running smoothly. Yet, despite the successes unfolding before him, he couldn't focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah's plea, her raw challenge to his privilege, to his detachment. She had made it clear that people needed more than money. They needed empathy. They needed people to stop seeing homelessness as something abstract and start seeing it as a real, human issue. Ethan tried to push the thoughts aside, but the more he did, the more persistent they became. He found himself questioning his life, his choices, and the way he had viewed the world for so long. How had he been so blind? How had he lived so comfortably, isolated from the struggles of those just outside his bubble, without truly understanding the depths of their pain? He decided to go for a walk to clear his mind. His penthouse overlooked the bustling city below, but when he stepped outside and walked into the heart of the city, the streets felt different today. The sound of traffic, the rush of people, the towering skyscrapers. Everything seemed less monumental, less important. He passed by several homeless individuals sitting on curbs, wrapped in tattered blankets, some clutching signs that read, "Hungry," or "Please help." He glanced at them briefly, but this time, he didn't look away immediately. Instead, he lingered on the scene, trying to see them not as distant, faceless figures, but as people, as human beings. A few moments later, he passed a small group of children huddled together near a corner, their faces dirty and their clothes ragged. They didn't ask for money. They simply stood there, playing with what looked like broken toys. A pang of guilt washed over him, an unfamiliar feeling. He didn't know how to respond to it. He kept walking, not wanting to confront the discomfort it stirred within him. But the images stayed with him, following him as he made his way back to his office building. When he sat down at his desk that afternoon, the weight of the decision began to settle in. Ethan had never been someone who shied away from challenges. He thrived on them. But this was different. This was not about business. This was about understanding something he had spent his life avoiding. He could no longer ignore the disconnect that existed between his reality and the world of those less fortunate. But how could he understand it? How could he bridge that gap? It didn't take long for his thoughts to coalesce into an idea, an almost irrational one. Something impulsive, yet somehow fitting for someone like him who was accustomed to always being in control. Ethan decided, in that moment, that he would spend a month living in a homeless shelter. At first, the idea seemed ludicrous. He, the CEO of a successful company, the man who had never known what it was like to struggle, to go without would live in a shelter? He imagined the discomfort, the lack of privacy, the humiliation. But as the initial wave of doubt passed, something in him stirred. This was the only way to understand, to truly see life from their perspective. He didn't want to just read statistics or hear stories. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to experience it in a visceral, unfiltered way. Only then could he possibly begin to comprehend the challenges, the choices, and the sheer resilience required to survive such an existence. Ethan knew the risks involved. There would be no special treatment for him in the shelter. He would be treated as just another person in need. That meant no luxury, no preferential treatment. It would be uncomfortable, humbling, perhaps even humiliating. And the thought of living among the very people he had previously viewed as other made him uneasy. But that discomfort was exactly what he needed. He had spent his life at the top, untouched by the realities that others faced. Now, he would step down, if only for a month, into a world that was foreign to him. As soon as he made up his mind, Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline. This was something bold, something no one in his circle would ever dare to do. He wasn't just going to donate money or lend his name to a cause. He was going to live the experience, fully immersed in it. In a way, it felt like a reinvention of himself, a challenge to everything he had come to believe about success, power, and human connection. He wasted no time in contacting a local shelter, asking to volunteer under the guise of a displaced office worker. Ethan knew he had to conceal his true identity. The last thing he wanted was for people to treat him differently because of his status or wealth. He needed to blend in, to experience the shelter life without the safety net of his name or reputation. He crafted a backstory, a mid-level office worker who had fallen on hard times after a series of bad decisions. It was a believable story, vague enough to pass unnoticed, yet real enough for him to slip into the role without arousing suspicion. Once his arrangement was set, Ethan spent the next few days mentally preparing for the experience. He stopped visiting his usual high-end gyms, opting instead for the public facilities near the shelter. He sold his car, opting for public transportation to make the transition feel as authentic as possible. As the days passed, a mixture of excitement and anxiety began to build inside him. What would it be like? What would he learn? And, most importantly, could he really handle it? The thought of confronting his own privilege, of stepping into a world he had long chosen to ignore, began to feel like a confrontation with his own identity. This wasn't just about understanding homelessness. It was about changing the way he saw himself in relation to the world. Ethan knew he was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, about people, and about life itself. By the time the day arrived, he was nervous, but resolute. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple clothes he had purchased to blend in: a pair of worn jeans, a faded jacket, a baseball cap to hide his face. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the person looking back at him. He was about to walk into a world where his name, his wealth, and his influence meant nothing. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with business deals or bottom lines. This was real, and it was going to change him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Ethan's first morning at the shelter was nothing like he had imagined. He arrived early, before the volunteers were even on the clock, standing at the entrance in his worn jeans and baseball cap, feeling an odd sense of vulnerability he wasn't used to. The shelter was located in an old, brick building tucked away in a quieter part of the city, surrounded by a patch of grass that was overgrown with weeds. As he stood there, looking at the unassuming structure, Ethan felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. The grandeur of his penthouse and office, the polished steel of his car, the comfort of his predictable routine, none of that mattered now. It was as if the world he had known had slipped away, leaving him at the mercy of something entirely unknown. The door swung open, and a tall man with graying hair, dressed in a faded green t-shirt and jeans, greeted him. "You the new guy?" His voice was gruff, with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. Ethan nodded and forced a smile, swallowing the nervous lump in his throat. The man gave him a quick once-over before stepping aside. "You're early," he remarked, stepping back to let Ethan inside. The building smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning products, a sharp contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned offices Ethan was used to. The lobby was small, with a few chairs huddled together near a bulletin board covered in notices about job openings, support groups, and upcoming events. There was a sense of clutter here. Papers strewn on tables, bags left unattended in corners, a worn-out couch with cushions askew. The atmosphere was not hostile, but it was far from warm. It was a space designed to function, not to comfort. "Name's Jeff. I'm one of the volunteers here," the man said, his tone more matter-of-fact than friendly. "We don't ask for much, just your help and a little bit of respect. You follow the rules, and we don't have a problem." His eyes studied Ethan closely, and Ethan realized the man wasn't just measuring him up. He was sizing up whether Ethan was capable of handling the reality of the shelter. Ethan nodded, trying to mask his discomfort. "I understand," he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice betrayed him. Jeff led him down a narrow hallway to the dormitory area, where rows of metal cots were spaced apart by thin curtains. It was bare and utilitarian, nothing like the luxury Ethan was used to. He tried to push away the shock he felt seeing the crowded space, the way the mattresses looked thin and stained, and the harsh overhead lights that cast everything in a cold, clinical glow. "Pick a bed," Jeff said, gesturing toward an empty cot near the back. Ethan didn't hesitate. He placed his duffel bag on the bed and sat down, feeling the hardness of the mattress beneath him. He looked around at the other cots, where a handful of people were already stirring, some still asleep, others awake, staring at the ceiling or quietly talking to one another. He recognized that they were probably used to this routine, the constant flux of people coming and going. But to Ethan, it felt like a disorienting crash course in the rawness of life. He was surrounded by people, yet he felt more isolated than ever before. As the morning wore on, the shelter began to come to life. People filtered into the cafeteria for breakfast, most of them not acknowledging Ethan as they passed. They were too absorbed in their own routines. Some looked tired, others anxious, some simply defeated. Ethan tried to blend in, making small talk with a few people in the line for food, but he quickly realized how out of place he truly was. His well-maintained appearance, the way he carried himself, everything about him screamed outsider. No one was rude, but there was a subtle detachment that made it clear that Ethan wasn't yet one of them. The food was simple: scrambled eggs, a slice of toast, and a cup of coffee that tasted more like burnt water than anything remotely caffeinated. Ethan didn't mind. He wasn't here for the comfort of a gourmet meal. He tried to eat quickly, but he couldn't ignore the way people around him looked at their food with a sense of urgency, as if it might be their last meal. The contrast between their attitude toward the meal and his own detached consumption was jarring. After breakfast, Jeff gave him a few chores to do: sorting donated clothes, cleaning the bathrooms, and organizing the common areas. It wasn't hard work, but the physical labor was a stark contrast to his usual life. Ethan was used to managing projects from behind a desk, delegating tasks, or overseeing operations from a distance. Here, he was just another set of hands, expected to pitch in like everyone else. There was no special treatment. He was just one person among many, doing what was needed to keep the shelter running. As the day unfolded, Ethan began to interact more with the residents. There was a woman in her late 30s named Carla, who was sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria. She had short, messy hair and a hard look in her eyes, as if she had seen too many things that had broken her. She was quiet, but not unfriendly. Ethan found himself drawn to her, not just because she was one of the few who seemed to be aware of his presence, but because she reminded him of someone he couldn't place, a version of himself, perhaps, that he had long since buried. He approached her carefully, unsure of how to begin. "You new here?" she asked, her voice low but not unkind. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just trying to figure things out." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the cot next to hers. "You'll get used to it," she said, not offering any words of comfort, but something else, an understanding that only someone who had lived through this life could offer. "You'll see, it's not about figuring things out, it's about surviving. Every day." Her words hung in the air, heavy with a truth that Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. Surviving. That was the goal for everyone in this place. It wasn't about dreams or aspirations. It wasn't about thriving or growing. It was about getting by, about scraping through another day. That realization, so simple, so stark, stirred something in Ethan that he hadn't expected. It wasn't sympathy he felt for Carla. It was a deeper recognition of the human condition, of the struggle for survival, for dignity, for a place to call home. By the time evening arrived, Ethan was exhausted. His body ached from the work, his mind from the constant adjustments to his new reality. The shelter's lights dimmed, and people began settling into their cots. The noise of the day gave way to the eerie quiet of the night, broken only by the occasional cough, the shuffle of feet, or the soft murmur of conversations between strangers. Ethan lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling, the thin fabric of his blanket too light against the cold. He had never experienced anything like this level of discomfort, this vulnerability. He had always been in control, always insulated from the harshness of the world. But now, in this bare, unadorned space, he was forced to face the reality of his own existence, his own privilege, in a way that was impossible to ignore. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come easily. The quiet of the night amplified the noise in his head, a constant hum of thoughts and emotions he had never allowed himself to feel before. He was a stranger here, yes, but more than that, he was beginning to realize how much of a stranger he had become to the world outside his own bubble. For the first time, Ethan wasn't just seeing homelessness from a distance. He was living it, and the weight of it, the crushing weight of understanding what it meant to survive in a world that had no room for you, was almost unbearable. Yet, despite the discomfort, despite the harshness of the reality around him, there was a part of him that knew this was where he needed to be. This was the only way forward. The first week at the shelter felt like a blur of disorientation. Ethan had expected discomfort, but he hadn't anticipated how profoundly isolated he would feel. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of sharing a dormitory with 20 other people or the harsh, utilitarian environment. It wasn't just the constant noise, the creaking of the building at night, the murmurs of people talking in their sleep, the shuffle of bare feet on cold floors. No, it was the emotional dissonance, the sense that no matter how hard he tried, he could never truly belong here. He had always been the center of his own world. Meetings, deals, decisions, all revolving around his presence. But now, in this unfamiliar place, he was a cog in a much larger, more complex machine. No one cared about his story or his accomplishments. No one knew who he was, and he was starting to understand how liberating that anonymity could feel for some. It was a relief not to have to play the role of the successful CEO. Here, he was just another person struggling to survive the day. Still, Ethan couldn't help but notice the walls he had to scale, both physical and emotional. The residents of the shelter were polite, but there was a distance. People exchanged brief greetings in the hallways, but no one sought him out. They were too caught up in their own survival, their own battles, to worry about a newcomer. And Ethan, despite all his wealth and influence, felt himself slipping into a place of quiet insignificance. He spent the first few days doing chores, sorting donations, cleaning the bathrooms, organizing the library of old books and magazines that no one seemed to touch. He worked alongside volunteers who came and went, never staying long enough to form any real connection. Jeff, the volunteer who had first welcomed him, kept his distance, offering only occasional instructions or gruff comments. Ethan didn't mind. He was here to observe, to learn. But the loneliness gnawed at him. Even when he worked, his mind kept returning to the same question. Why am I doing this? By the end of the week, he had begun to interact more with the residents, though still in limited ways. One evening, as he was cleaning up after dinner, a man approached him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a black beanie that obscured his thinning hair. His face was rough, the stubble on his chin graying. He looked like someone who had been through his share of battles, both physical and emotional. Ethan had seen him around the shelter several times, but they had never spoken. The man's name was Will, and his presence had always been quiet, but intimidating, as if he carried a lifetime of pain in his gaze. "Hey," Will said one evening as Ethan scrubbed down a countertop in the cafeteria. "You're new here, huh?" His voice was low, rough with a gravelly edge, as if speaking was a labor. Ethan nodded, pausing in his work. "Yeah," he replied. "I'm just helping out." Will gave him a long look, the kind of look that seemed to see straight through him. It wasn't judgmental, exactly. It was just observant. "You don't look like the others," he said, his eyes flicking over Ethan's clothes, the slightly too clean look about him. "You seem different." Ethan felt an uncomfortable stir in his chest. He had tried so hard to blend in, to avoid standing out, yet Will had seen right through him. He could feel a flush creeping up his neck. I guess I'm not used to this," Ethan said, his voice betraying an unexpected vulnerability. "It's hard to understand what it's really like. To live it, you know?" He stopped himself, unsure of how to continue. It was strange talking so openly. He wasn't used to admitting weakness, to acknowledging that there was something he didn't understand, something he needed to learn. Will didn't immediately respond. He just watched Ethan, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he was weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, after a long pause, Will spoke again. "Most people don't get it," he said, his voice softer now. "They come in here, they throw some money around, act like they're doing something great, but they don't live it. They don't feel it. They can't, because they ain't been through it. But if you really want to understand, you'll start seeing things different." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He had heard versions of that message before, on charity boards, in interviews and speeches by philanthropists. But hearing it from someone who had lived it, someone who had spent years in and out of shelters, was different. It felt real. Will wasn't speaking in abstract terms. He was speaking from the raw, painful place of experience. "I'm trying," Ethan said, the words feeling awkward, almost too simple. "I just don't know if I can ever really get it. I've never had to." He stopped himself, realizing how foolish it sounded. The truth was, he had never had to struggle. Not really. Not like Will. Will's eyes softened, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something unguarded, something human, in his gaze. "You don't get it by trying," Will said, his voice gentler now. "You get it by living it, by being here in the grind. It's not about understanding the problem from a distance. It's about getting down in the dirt and doing the work. You'll figure it out." Ethan wasn't sure what to say, so he didn't respond at all. Instead, he nodded, a silent acknowledgement that he was still learning, still absorbing the truth of what Will had said. He had come to the shelter thinking that he could simply observe, that he could walk through the experience, check the box, and then leave. But now, after just 1 week, he was beginning to realize that it wasn't that simple. There were layers to this life, layers of pain, resilience, hope, and despair that he had never fully understood until now. The next few days were a blur of interactions that felt like small victories for Ethan. He started speaking more with the other residents, offering help when he could, learning the rhythms of the shelter. The morning rush for breakfast, the quiet moments of downtime when people drifted into the common areas to read, talk, or simply zone out. He wasn't accepted as one of them, not yet, but he was starting to be seen. He wasn't just a guy who had shown up out of nowhere. He was starting to be part of the fabric of the shelter, woven into the lives of the people who lived there. Carla, the woman he had noticed on his first day, began talking to him more frequently. She had a sharp sense of humor, and over time, Ethan found himself looking forward to their conversations. She didn't ask him about his past, and he didn't volunteer it. Instead, they talked about the here and now, the small moments that made up their lives at the shelter. One evening, as they sat together during the mandatory quiet hours, Carla said something that stuck with Ethan. "You know," she said, her voice low, "the hardest part isn't the cold or the hunger. It's the waiting to get back up. You keep waiting for something to change, but you don't know if it ever will." Ethan turned toward her, sensing the weight of her words. There was a quiet sadness in her tone, a resignation that he hadn't noticed before. "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "I guess the hardest part is just surviving the waiting." Carla smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. "That's what we all do. Wait. Survive. It's the only thing you can do when you don't have anything else." The simplicity of her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. It wasn't about hope anymore. It was about endurance. It wasn't about the future. It was about the present, getting through the next hour, the next day, and the day after that. As the days went by, Ethan began to see the shelter as something more than a temporary experiment. It wasn't a place for him to observe the struggles of others from the sidelines. It was a place where he had to live the struggle. It wasn't enough to simply ask questions and receive answers. He had to be part of the answer. He had to be a part of the solution. And in doing so, he began to realize something deeper than he had ever anticipated. The shelter wasn't just a physical place. It was a living, breathing entity of people, all of them trying to get by. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't watching. He was living it. By the end of his second week at the shelter, Ethan had begun to settle into a rhythm. It wasn't easy, but it was becoming more familiar. The shock of the newness, of the discomfort, had faded somewhat. He woke up each morning to the sound of footsteps in the hallways, the low hum of the shelter's collective activity, a slow, mechanical engine of survival. People shuffled through their routines with a sense of purpose, despite the grittiness of it all. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, chores until noon, free time in the afternoon to read or rest, and then a communal dinner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was predictable. Yet, the more time Ethan spent in the shelter, the more he realized that predictability was not the same as stability. Each person was simply managing their day, moving from one task to the next, filling the hours with whatever they could get by. There was a quiet desperation in the air, an understanding that life here was not about planning for the future. It was about surviving the present. One evening, as Ethan helped serve dinner, he noticed a new face in the cafeteria. A young man, no older than 20, sat alone at one of the long tables, picking at his food. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders hunched. Ethan had seen him before, but the young man hadn't really interacted with anyone yet. There was a stillness about him that made him hard to approach, as though he were too lost in his thoughts to engage with the world around him. After dinner, as the volunteers began to clean up, Ethan found himself walking toward the young man's table. There was something about him that seemed out of place, like he didn't belong here, even though clearly he did. Ethan took a breath and sat across from him, unsure of what he was doing, but driven by an instinct that had started to guide him through these past few weeks. Reach out, even if you don't know how. The young man looked up, startled by the presence. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His clothes were disheveled, as if he hadn't bothered to care much about his appearance. "Hey," Ethan said softly, not wanting to startle him further. "You doing okay?" The young man looked at him for a moment, then shrugged, his eyes dropping again to his half-eaten food. "Yeah, I guess." His voice was flat, barely above a whisper. There was a hesitation in his words that made Ethan feel like he was treading on fragile ground. "I've noticed you've been kind of quiet," Ethan continued, unsure how else to approach him. "Is it your first time here?" The young man nodded, but he didn't look up. "Yeah, my first time. I don't really know what I'm doing here." Ethan watched him for a few moments, trying to think of what to say. He wanted to offer some comfort, some advice, but he knew how hollow that could sound coming from someone who had only been there for a couple of weeks himself. The young man's situation was different, and the pain in his eyes suggested a deeper story, one Ethan didn't want to pry into, but one he couldn't ignore. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Ethan said, keeping his tone gentle. "But if you ever need to talk, or if you just need someone to sit with, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The young man seemed to take in the words, his eyes flicking toward Ethan briefly before returning to his plate. It was a small acknowledgement, but it was enough. It was the first step in what felt like a tentative connection, one built on the fragile foundation of shared humanity and unspoken understanding. For the rest of the evening, Ethan sat with him in silence, offering a quiet presence, something the young man didn't seem to want to acknowledge but also didn't seem to mind. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, Ethan found the young man in the same spot at breakfast, and this time, he nodded at Ethan as he took a seat. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a breakthrough. Over the next few days, they started to exchange a few words, nothing significant, but enough to make Ethan realize that sometimes the simplest connection could make the biggest difference. The young man's name was Caleb, and over the following week, Ethan learned more about him, though not in any grand revelations. Caleb wasn't ready to share his full story, but bits and pieces of his life began to surface in their quiet exchanges. He had come to the shelter after being kicked out of his parents' house. He had been homeless for months before arriving, and the anger and confusion in his eyes when he spoke of his family's rejection were raw. His parents had never understood his struggles, never asked about the pain he carried. It had taken him losing everything to realize that he couldn't keep running from his past. Ethan listened, without judgment or interruption, as Caleb slowly began to let down his guard. He wasn't looking for advice or sympathy. He just wanted to be heard. It was in these moments that Ethan understood something crucial. The people in this shelter didn't want to be fixed. They didn't need someone to swoop in and save them. They needed connection. They needed to feel seen, understood, and above all, human. One afternoon, as Ethan helped Caleb with a small chore, Caleb finally looked up at him with a faint, uncertain smile. "You know," he said quietly, "I don't really trust a lot of people. But you're different. You didn't try to fix me. You just listened. That means something." Ethan was taken aback, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't expected gratitude, but there it was in Caleb's eyes, a recognition that Ethan's presence, his willingness to just be there, mattered. And in that moment, Ethan realized just how little it took to break down the barriers of isolation. The experience was eye-opening. It wasn't the big gestures that made the difference, Ethan realized. It was the small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of listening, that had the power to change things. Caleb's trust didn't come from Ethan's advice. It came from his willingness to show up, without expectation, without an agenda. But as much as these small connections were rewarding, they also brought Ethan face to face with a truth he had been trying to avoid. The shelter wasn't just about survival. It was about healing, and healing took time. As much as Ethan wanted to help, he knew he couldn't do it all. He couldn't offer quick fixes or immediate solutions. He could only offer himself, his presence, and his willingness to walk alongside the people who had been through more than he could ever imagine. And so, as the days passed, Ethan's relationship with Caleb deepened. They began to spend more time together, talking about things that weren't related to their circumstances. They spoke about music, about the books they liked, about the things they dreamed of when they were younger. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build a foundation of trust, a foundation that Caleb had never had before, not even with his own family. One evening, after a particularly long day of chores, Caleb pulled Ethan aside. "I don't know if this will mean much to you," he said quietly, "but thanks. I've been to a lot of places, seen a lot of people, but what you're doing, just sitting with me, this is the first time I felt like maybe I'm not invisible." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. The truth of what Caleb was saying, the painful reality of being unseen for so long, was something Ethan hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't about giving people everything they needed. It was about showing them that they mattered, that their lives had value. Ethan could feel his resolve hardening, solidifying into something more than just a desire to understand. It was a commitment to be there, not just for Caleb, but for everyone in this shelter. He couldn't save them, and he couldn't fix the systemic issues that had led to their homelessness. But he could offer something simple: his attention, his care, and his belief that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserved to be seen. That night, as he lay in his cot, Ethan felt something shift within him. This wasn't just an experiment anymore. This wasn't just a quest for understanding. This was a beginning of seeing people as they truly were, not as statistics or problems, but as human beings with stories, pain, and potential. And that, Ethan realized, was the most important lesson of all. By the third week, Ethan had begun to feel a shift, not just in how he saw the residents of the shelter, but in how he saw himself. Each day brought new lessons, but it also brought new challenges. There was still a layer of discomfort he couldn't entirely shake, that feeling of being a stranger in a place he wasn't meant to belong. But it was no longer the overwhelming sense of isolation it had been in the beginning. Now, it was more like an undercurrent, a hum of awareness that reminded him every moment here was a learning experience, an immersion into a reality that was foreign to him, but essential to understand. Ethan had initially thought of the shelter as a place of problems, brokenness, despair, dysfunction. But now, after spending so much time with the residents, he began to see that the shelter was more than just a refuge for people in crisis. It was a place of survival, yes, but it was also a place of resilience. Each person had a story, a past that had led them here. And while not all of those stories were ones they shared openly, they were there, woven into the fabric of the shelter's daily life. There was Tina, a woman in her early 40s who had spent years living on the streets. Her hair was graying at the temples, and her clothes were threadbare, but her spirit was sharp. Tina had been a waitress in her younger days, but a series of bad decisions and the addiction that had followed had cost her everything. She didn't talk much about her addiction, but when she did, there was no bitterness in her voice, only resignation and the quiet wisdom of someone who had lived through far too much. Tina had become one of Ethan's regular companions during breakfast. Their conversations were quiet, sometimes awkward, but often real. She never judged him for his lack of understanding, and in return, he learned to appreciate her directness. She didn't mince words. She didn't waste time on niceties. Then there was Jason, the man who had lived in the shelter for 5 years. Jason had been a lawyer once, he'd told Ethan, before a failed marriage, a DUI, and the loss of his license to practice led him down a spiral into homelessness. Jason didn't often speak about his past, but there were glimpses, like when he would read the newspaper in the morning, studying the legal articles with a keen eye, or when he'd nod along with the evening discussions about current events. His knowledge of the law was still sharp, even though his formal career had long ended. Jason had become one of the voices of reason in the shelter, offering advice and mentorship to the younger residents when they needed it. Ethan admired him, though he often struggled with the quiet bitterness that sometimes seeped into Jason's words, a bitterness that Ethan couldn't quite understand. But the person who truly began to open Ethan's eyes to the deep layers of pain and possibility in this place was Rebecca, a woman in her mid-30s who had been living in the shelter for over a year. Rebecca had been an artist once, she said. She had painted, sculpted, created with a passion that filled her world. But a violent relationship, a broken marriage, and the subsequent financial fallout had sent her spiraling. Unlike the others, Rebecca didn't talk about the shelter much. She talked about her art, her lost art. She had given up on it when everything fell apart, convinced she'd never create again. But every now and then, when no one was around, she'd bring out a sketchbook from under her bed and draw. Sometimes it was just abstract patterns. Other times it was the faces of the people around her. One afternoon, after watching Rebecca sketch for hours, Ethan found himself sitting beside her, watching in quiet admiration. He had never thought much about art, at least not in the way she did. He was used to seeing it as a commodity, as something to be bought and sold. But here, watching her, he saw it differently. It was a release, a form of expression, a way of processing the world around her. "How do you do it?" Ethan asked one day, his voice tentative, as though unsure of how to even phrase the question. Rebecca didn't look up from her sketchbook. "Do what?" "Make something beautiful when everything around you is, well, this..." Ethan gestured vaguely to the room, the shelter, the lives that surrounded them. "How do you keep going?" Rebecca paused, then set down her pencil. She leaned back, her eyes meeting his. "Because I have to. I don't know how else to be. I can't stop creating, even when the world's falling apart around me. It's the only thing that keeps me from forgetting that I'm still here. You know what I mean?" Ethan thought about that for a long time. He realized that he had never truly created anything in his life, not in the way Rebecca did. He had built his empire through deals, through strategy, through numbers. But he had never built something purely from himself, something that was a true extension of who he was. He wondered, for the first time, if that was why he had always felt something was missing. Perhaps, in the pursuit of success, he had forgotten how to create for creation's sake. Perhaps that was what had led him to this shelter in the first place. To rediscover what it meant to be, rather than to simply do. It was during these interactions, these conversations with people like Rebecca, Tina, and Jason, that Ethan began to feel the weight of change. He had thought that his time in the shelter would be about offering help, about providing solutions for people who were struggling. But instead, he was realizing that the real lesson was about receiving. He was learning to receive the raw, unvarnished truth of people's lives. He He was learning to see beyond the surface and recognize the depth of their stories, to understand that homelessness wasn't a problem to solve, but a condition to understand. And that understanding was a difficult thing to hold. It was messy, and it didn't come with easy answers. It was full of contradictions and emotional complexity. But it was real. It was human. One evening, after another long day, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the common room, staring out at the city skyline through the window. He had become accustomed to the quiet of the shelter at night, to the soft rustling of people settling into their beds. But tonight something felt different. The weight of the past few weeks was pressing on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the shelter had somehow become a mirror for his own life. He had come here to escape his privileged bubble, to understand the struggles of the people around him. But now, it felt like the shelter was holding a mirror to his own soul, reflecting back the emptiness he had been running from. The work, the deals, the constant drive for more. Had it all really been worth it? For the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself questioning the ultimate purpose of his life. It wasn't a question of money or success, but of meaning. What was the true purpose of the life he had built? He had learned so much about survival, about resilience, about the raw determination that defined people who had lost everything and still found a way to keep going. But he hadn't yet answered the question of why. Why he had spent so many years chasing after something that now seemed so far removed from the people who were actually living. That night, as he lay in his cot, staring up at the darkened ceiling, Ethan realized that he was not the same person who had walked into the shelter 3 weeks ago. He had come here thinking he could offer solutions. Now, he realized that the only solution was to continue listening, to continue being present, and to continue understanding. The weight of that realization was heavy, but it was a weight he was finally ready to bear. The days were starting to blur together, the constant hum of the shelter's routine now a part of Ethan's daily life. It wasn't the harsh environment it had once seemed to be, but a space alive with stories, laughter, pain, and survival. As Ethan spent more time with the residents, his sense of self had begun to shift. His original intention, to understand the struggles of the less fortunate, had morphed into something more profound. It wasn't just about learning from them anymore. He was beginning to understand that the act of giving wasn't one-sided. He had been receiving something far more valuable than any donation or charity he could offer. His relationship with Caleb in particular had deepened. Over the past few days, Ethan had seen subtle changes in the young man's behavior. Caleb, who had been so withdrawn at first, was beginning to open up more, not just to Ethan, but to others in the shelter as well. He was talking more, offering advice, even helping out with chores that he had once avoided. Ethan didn't delude himself into thinking that this transformation was easy or that Caleb's struggles were over. But there was a spark in Caleb now, something that hadn't been there before, a glimmer of hope. And that Ethan realized was the beginning of something important. One afternoon, Ethan sat down with Caleb during a rare moment of quiet, just outside the cafeteria. Caleb was tracing patterns on a napkin, his eyes distant, as if he were lost in thought. Ethan watched him for a moment before speaking. "You've changed," Ethan said, his voice quiet but certain. "You've been helping out more, talking to people. It's good to see." Caleb looked up, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot. About things, about where I want to go next." He hesitated, as though unsure if he should continue. "I used to think there was no way out of this life. But now it feels like there might be something more, Ethan nodded, understanding more than Caleb knew. "I think you're starting to see it," he said. "Sometimes the hardest part is believing you can get out of the dark, that you're worth the fight." Caleb smiled faintly, but the sadness in his eyes didn't disappear. "I think I'm starting to believe that." "Thanks, Ethan. I don't know how to explain it, but you've helped more than you probably realize." Ethan felt a swell of emotion that he quickly suppressed. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter, gratitude. He had come here thinking he was the one who would give, but what he hadn't anticipated was the way he would be changed by the very people he had come to help. And Caleb wasn't the only one who had begun to transform. As the weeks wore on, Ethan found himself more and more entrenched in the lives of the residents. His relationships with them, once casual and distant, had grown into genuine friendships. He helped Tina with her job applications when she decided to try to get back into the workforce. He worked with Rebecca on her art, encouraging her to paint again, despite her doubts about her abilities. Jason, with his legal knowledge, had become an invaluable resource for anyone who needed advice, and Ethan began to help him set up workshops to educate the residents about their rights, about navigating the legal system. It wasn't grand charity. It was practical, real help, born from listening and responding to needs that were often invisible to those outside the shelter. One evening, as Ethan was leaving the shelter to grab some fresh air, he was stopped by Linda, the shelter manager. Linda was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s, sharp as a tack, but with a warmth that came out when she needed it. She had kept an eye on Ethan since he'd first arrived, and her respect for him had grown as she watched him integrate into the shelter community. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Linda asked, her voice steady. Ethan nodded, a little curious. "Sure." She motioned for him to follow her to her office. Once they were inside, she closed the door behind them and sat down behind her desk. "I've been meaning to talk to you. I've been watching you," she said bluntly. "You've been working with a lot of the residents, helping them out in ways that go beyond just giving them handouts. I think that's commendable." Ethan felt a little uncomfortable under her gaze, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "I'm just doing what I can." "I don't." She raised a hand to stop him. "I know you're not here for praise, Ethan. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that you've got a unique opportunity here. You've got the resources to make a real difference. And I can see you're starting to understand that it's not just about money. It's about connection. It's about creating opportunities where people can help themselves." Ethan sat silently, absorbing her words. "I've been trying to learn, trying to figure out what real help looks like." Linda smiled slightly, the lines around her eyes softening. "And you're getting there. But I've got to ask you something. You're not going to stay here forever. What's your plan once you leave?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The question had been lingering in the back of his mind for weeks now, but he had avoided confronting it. He had come to the shelter for a month, and his time was almost up. What would he do then? What could he do? I don't know," he admitted finally. "I didn't come here with any plan beyond understanding. But now, I can't just walk away and forget about all of this. I don't know how to explain it, but I've seen so much, and I don't think I can go back to life as it was before." Linda nodded thoughtfully. "You're at a crossroads, Ethan. You've seen what's possible when people connect with each other, when they believe in each other. That's a powerful thing. And it's not just about charity. It's about giving people the means to help themselves. You can be a part of that, if you choose." Ethan felt a weight settle over him. Linda's words echoed the thoughts he had been grappling with for weeks now. The idea that change was possible, but only if people worked together, if they empowered each other. He had been ready to leave the shelter, to return to the life he knew, but now he wasn't so sure. As the days passed, Ethan spent more time thinking about Linda's words. He spoke with some of the residents about their hopes and plans for the future, about how the shelter could do more than just provide a temporary roof. Many of them had dreams, some big, some small, but all of them had a desire to change their lives. And Ethan realized that he didn't have to walk away from the shelter to make a difference. He had resources, networks, and influence. He could be part of a larger solution, something that extended beyond charity. He could help create pathways for people to rise above their circumstances, to find hope in places they never thought possible. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, resources, and an investment of his own energy. But for the first time, Ethan knew what he had to do. He didn't need to give money or handouts. He needed to invest in people's potential, in their ability to rebuild and find purpose. And that, he realized, was the real key to change. It wasn't about offering temporary fixes. It was about building lasting relationships, offering support where it was needed most, and helping people find the strength to help themselves. And that was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the days drew closer to the end of Ethan's month-long stay, there was an unspoken tension in the shelter. The residents had begun to sense that his time with them was almost over. Some had started pulling back, hesitant to form new attachments, while others sought to make the most of the remaining time they had with him. Ethan couldn't deny that he too was feeling the weight of this approaching separation. It was hard to imagine walking away from the shelter, from the people who had become so central to his life. His work was no longer just about observing. It had become personal. On his last night at the shelter, Ethan found himself sitting in the common room, reflecting on everything he had experienced. It was a quiet evening. The hum of the shelter's routine softened by the late hour. Most of the residents had already gone to bed, but a few lingered, sitting in the dim light, talking quietly amongst themselves. Ethan's gaze fell on the faces he had come to know so well. Faces that were etched with the marks of hardship, but also with resilience, determination, and hope. He had witnessed their struggles, but he had also seen the growth, the transformation in each of them. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "You leaving tomorrow?" It was Tina, sitting across the room with a cup of coffee in hand. She had always been the one to speak her mind, but tonight there was something vulnerable in her tone. Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, it's been a month already. Time goes fast." Tina studied him for a moment, then sighed. "I thought you might stay longer. You've been different from the others, you know? Not just some guy with a big wallet who comes in, gives a handout, and leaves. You listened. You actually cared." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. It had been the one thing he had never expected, to find that kind of connection. He had thought that by stepping into their world, he could offer them something. But in reality, they had given him more than he could have imagined. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you," Ethan said softly. "I came here thinking I had all the answers. But now, I realize that's not how it works. We're all just trying to get by, trying to figure it out." Tina smiled, her eyes softening. "I get that. We all do. But it's what we do with the getting by that counts." Ethan paused, letting her words settle in his mind. It was true. Every day was a new challenge in the shelter, but it was also a new chance to rebuild, to grow, to move forward, even if just a little bit. He had witnessed that in the residents, their refusal to be defined by their circumstances, their determination to make something of themselves, no matter how small the step. He felt a deep, overwhelming respect for them. Before he could say more, Caleb appeared in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He had been quieter than usual lately, still processing the whirlwind of changes that had come with Ethan's presence. But tonight, he looked different, more assured, more certain of himself. "Hey, Ethan," Caleb said, his voice low but steady. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Ethan stood up and nodded, motioning for Caleb to join him. The two of them stepped out onto the small porch, the cool evening air wrapping around them like a blanket. Caleb leaned against the railing, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights, the noise of the world beyond the shelter, a faint hum in the background. "I've been thinking," Caleb began, his voice quieter now, as if unsure of what to say next. "About the things we've talked about getting my life together, about not giving up." He paused, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't know how to explain it, but being here with you, it's like something clicked. I'm not saying everything's fixed, but for the first time, I feel like maybe I've got a shot at something. I don't know what that something is yet, but I think I'm starting to believe it's possible." Ethan felt a wave of emotion rise within him. Caleb had come to the shelter a broken man, angry, resentful, barely able to look anyone in the eye. And now, here he was speaking with a clarity Ethan had never seen in him before. It wasn't about solving all his problems, but about shifting his perspective, about believing in a future he had long since abandoned. "I'm proud of you," Ethan said, his voice rough. "You're doing the hard work, Caleb, and that's all anyone can ask for." Caleb looked at him, a hesitant smile forming on his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you, Ethan. You made me believe I could." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had come to the shelter wanting to make a difference, to help in some way. But he never expected to become the catalyst for someone else's transformation. He realized that was the true power of connection. Not that he could solve all of their problems, but that he could help them find their own strength. They already had it inside them. They just needed someone to remind them of it. The next morning, Ethan packed up his things in silence. The shelter was already beginning to wake up, the sounds of people preparing for another day filling the air. As he slung his bag over his shoulder, he took one last look around the room. The walls that had once felt so foreign, so unwelcoming, now felt like a second home, a place where he had learned, grown, and discovered the true meaning of community. Before he left, he stopped by the cafeteria where a group of residents were gathered for breakfast. They greeted him with quiet smiles, nodding in recognition, as if they too understood that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Linda caught his eye from across the room and motioned for him to come over. She stood, her arms crossed, a rare smile on her face. "Well, look at you," she said. "You've made it through?" Ethan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I made it through. More than that, though, I think I found something here. Something I wasn't expecting." "I figured as much," Linda said, her tone knowing. "You're not the same man who walked in here a month ago. And neither are they." She gestured to the residents around them, some of whom had been transformed in ways that weren't always visible to outsiders, but were undeniably real. Ethan nodded. "I've learned a lot, more than I thought possible." "Good," Linda replied. "Because if you really want to make a difference, it's about more than just giving. It's about understanding. And you're starting to get it?" He gave her a small smile. "I hope so." Before he left, he pulled out his phone and texted Rebecca, his last remaining connection to the art community he had almost abandoned. He told her he had found a studio space and asked if she would like to meet soon to talk about her work. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, an understanding of how his world could intersect with theirs, not from a place of charity, but from a place of true, meaningful exchange. As he stepped out of the shelter for the final time, Ethan realized that what he had learned in those 4 weeks wasn't just about the residents of the shelter. It was about himself. He had come to offer help, but what he had received was a new perspective on life. One rooted in empathy, in connection, in recognizing the shared humanity of all people, regardless of their circumstances. As the door closed behind him, he felt the weight of the last month settle into his bones. It wasn't over. The journey was just beginning. Ethan stood outside the shelter, the early morning light filtering through the clouds, casting long shadows on the pavement. The city around him was waking up, just as he was from a month of introspection and transformation. He had imagined this moment, the moment of leaving the shelter, countless times during his stay. He had thought it would feel like a relief, an escape from the discomfort, the emotional challenges, and the rawness of the shelter's daily reality. But now, standing on the threshold, he realized that he didn't feel any of that. What he felt was something deeper, something quieter, more permanent. He had arrived a man driven by the need to understand, to analyze, and perhaps even to redeem himself. But in the end, it wasn't about understanding others. It was about understanding himself, about realizing that no amount of success or wealth could fill the emptiness he had felt for so long. He had come into this experience thinking he had answers, but he had left with questions that would haunt him for years to come. The shelter had not just been a place to witness poverty and suffering. It had been a place where he had discovered a new form of wealth, the wealth of human connection, of shared vulnerability, of hope. It was a wealth that no amount of money could buy, a wealth built from the courage to face hardship, to rise above it, and to offer others the chance to do the same. As he walked away from the shelter, the weight of the past month settled on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility. He knew that leaving wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. A beginning not defined by his old life, but by something that had been seated here in the hearts of the people he had come to know. He had made promises to some of the residents, promises to stay in touch, to help when he could. He planned to do just that, but it wasn't about charity. It was about offering the support and connections that would help them sustain their progress. Caleb, Tina, Jason, Rebecca. Each of them had shown him a path forward, not just through words, but through their actions. They were all fighting, not just for survival, but for something greater. The right to reclaim their lives, to rise again, no matter how many times they had fallen. And Ethan had come to realize that helping them wasn't about giving them something they didn't have. It was about giving them the tools to see their own worth, their own potential. As he made his way through the city streets, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed Linda's number. She picked up after the first ring. "You made it," she said, her voice warm, but with an edge of amusement. "How are you feeling?" I'm okay," Ethan said, a chuckle escaping his lips. "I think I'm starting to process it all. It's not what I expected, Linda. It's bigger than that. I didn't just help anyone here. I've been helped more than I can put into words. Linda was silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then she replied, her voice steady. That's what I was hoping you'd find. That's what you needed to see. And I think you're starting to get it, Ethan. You're not the same person who came in here. No, Ethan agreed quietly. I'm not. I've realized it's not about fixing the world. It's about being there for people when they need it most. It's about believing in them, even when they don't believe in themselves. Linda's voice softened. I think you're going to do good things, Ethan. Bigger things than you ever imagined. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had, in many ways, been a guide to him during his stay. I'm starting to think that too, but it's not going to be easy. I know that. It's going to take time, and I've got a lot to learn. There's no rush, Linda said, her tone light but reassuring. Just take it one step at a time. You've already learned the most important thing. Change happens one person at a time. You'll figure it out. As he ended the call, Ethan found himself at a crossroads once again. But this time, it was a crossroads with a new clarity, a new sense of purpose. His life, which had once been so structured, so driven by the need to conquer and accumulate, now felt open to possibilities he had never considered. He wasn't going to abandon his business or his wealth. He had worked too hard for those things, but he knew now that his success could no longer be measured solely in financial terms. It would be measured by the lives he touched, by the impact he had on the people who needed help, not from a distance, but up close. He passed a park on his way back to his apartment, its grassy expanses dotted with families, joggers, and people just taking in the early morning air. A few children were playing with a soccer ball nearby, their laughter ringing out in the crisp air. Ethan paused for a moment, watching them. It was a simple moment, but in it he saw everything he had been missing. It wasn't the luxury of his penthouse or the deals he closed in boardrooms that mattered. It was moments like this, moments of connection, of shared joy, of seeing people simply living. That was what he had been searching for all along. As he stood there, something stirred within him. He knew what he had to do. His next steps wouldn't be easy, but they would be meaningful. He needed to go back to the shelter, to reconnect with those he had left behind. He needed to find a way to ensure that the relationships he had built there weren't just temporary, that they could last, that they could grow. The work he had begun in those halls, in those conversations, in the quiet moments with Caleb, Tina, Rebecca, and Jason, it wasn't over. It couldn't be. As Ethan turned back toward his apartment, the weight of his decisions was lighter than it had ever been. He had learned that life wasn't about getting to the top. It was about who you brought with you when you got there. And he had learned that it wasn't just about providing for people. It was about empowering them, about giving them the tools to believe in themselves, just as they had done for him. The day stretched out ahead of him, full of promise. The future, once so uncertain, now seemed full of potential. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt truly alive, connected, grounded, and ready to build something that would outlast his wealth, his business, and his legacy. It was time to step forward. And this time, he wasn't going to do it alone. That I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.